Hello everybody and welcome to today's Daily Devotional. Our devotional is going to be based in Isaiah chapter 65, the first 5 verses. God is condemning his people, and he's explaining why he's upset with them, why he's angry with them. Upset doesn't even begin to describe how angry he is. Starting in verse 1, Jehovah says, "I was sought by those who did not ask for me. I was found by those who did not seek me. I said, here I am, to a nation that was not called my name. I have stretched out my hands all day long to a rebellious people who walk in a way that is not good according to their own thoughts." Obviously, Isaiah 65 is quoted several times in the New Testament as well. How the Jews interpreted this, I'm not sure, but obviously the New Testament, and we understand that God is talking about the Gentiles in verse 1 and the Jews in verse 2. He goes on to describe his people and their behavior. He says in verse 3, "A people who provoke me to anger continually to my face, who sacrifice in gardens and burn incense on altars of brick, who sit among the graves and spend the night in the tombs, who eat swine's flesh, and the broth of abominable things is in their vessels." Now, whether God literally means that they're sitting among the graves and spending nights in tombs, or if that's symbolic of the defilement of the people, I'm not sure. Eating swine's flesh, that would, again, under the Old Testament of the Mosaical law, that would have been sinful, that would have been defiled. Those were things that were not right for the children of Israel to eat. Again, whether God's speaking literally that they're eating swine's flesh, or again, if he's expressing just how angry he is at the defilement, the sinfulness of his people. Again, I'm not sure. But he's explaining just how bad his people are. Okay, and again, whether it's literal, I mean, I don't know why they would be sitting among the graves and spending night in tombs. But whether it's literal or figurative, obviously this is describing behavior from God's people that is directly in contrast, directly contradictory to what God had told them to do and how he wanted them to live. And so in verse 5, "Who say, keep to yourself, do not come near me, for I am holier than you." Again, generally speaking, sometimes we refer to the holier than thou attitude, and generally it's not people literally saying I'm holier than you. It's how they act, it's how they conduct themselves that gives that impression or leaves that impression on people. But again, they literally could have been saying, keep to yourself, don't come near me, I'm holier than you are, I don't want to spend time with you, I don't want to touch you, I don't want to be around you. Who are self-righteous is the idea. And then at the end of verse 5, he says, "These are smoke in my nostrils, a fire that burns all the day." Now, when he says these, I have a tendency to think that these aren't necessarily the people themselves. I think we're talking about their actions, their conduct, how the things that they're doing. They're smoke in my nostrils. Their sacrifices are smoke in his nostrils. And God is suggesting here that this is not a pleasant aroma. This is not something that is coming up as a sweet aroma sacrifice to me. The things that you're doing are wrong and evil, and the smoke in my nostrils, the stench, I guess you could say, in my nostrils, it's a fire that burns all day long and it doesn't stop. Now, I want you to consider what God says through Isaiah here in Isaiah 65 about the works of his people and how that they are wicked and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so the sacrifices they offer, the things that they do, how they behave, it's all a nasty smell to God, a nasty aroma to God. Contrast that with passages like Ephesians chapter 5. Starting in verse 1, Paul says, "Therefore be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love, as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma." When Paul talks about what Jesus did for us, He says, be imitators of God and walk in love. So he talks about being imitators of God, and certainly Jehovah God is part of that. But then he references Jesus, God, as that. Jesus the Son also being God. He references Jesus' behavior, Jesus' example. He says, walk in love as Christ loved us. He gave himself for us. And then in doing that, what Jesus did by fulfilling the will of the Father and by giving himself for us because he loved us, it presented an offering and a sacrifice to God that was a sweet-smelling aroma. Instead of smoke filling God's nostrils from the works of his people, who were wicked, back in Isaiah 65, what Jesus did in devotion and loyalty and love was a sweet-smelling sacrifice. This was something that God was pleased with. And so compare that now with Philippians 4 verse 18. When Paul's describing the recognition of the need to be content, he describes this, the verse 15 through 17, the fact that I'm glad that you're able to help me again. They were supporting Paul through the gospel. And then in verse 17, Paul says, not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. Almost verbatim, the language he uses in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 2 about Jesus and his sacrifice. Not necessarily, he's not comparing the two, saying that what they did is the same as Jesus giving his life. That's not the point. The point that Paul's making, though, is that they were giving of themselves in love. They were offering up their works, the things that they were doing, their behavior, their conduct, their example, the things they were doing were out of the same characteristics as what Jesus did, out of loyalty, out of love, out of devotion, out of desire to serve God and to serve their brethren. So what they did is they sent through Epaphroditus whatever it was, money. I mean, it could have been food. Sometimes people that they link the sweet-smelling aroma to food, but I don't believe that's what Paul's describing. It may have been, and that may have been a double point. If it was food, it may have been Paul saying it smelled great. It could be, but I think that this is more along the lines of this spiritual relationship of their behavior, of their conduct, and in this case, their sacrifice of giving of themselves, giving their means, and sending it to Paul through Epaphroditus. And Paul says this is to God a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. Okay, to God, this is something that, it's not just something you're doing for me. It's something that God recognizes. It's behavior and conduct and a sacrifice that God sees, and in this case, smells. And I think that's really interesting when you compare Isaiah 65 to Ephesians 5:2 and here in Philippians 4:18, how that people's behavior is related to a sacrifice, and how that sacrifice can have one of two, and there's only two that we find in the Bible, end results. It can either be a sweet-smelling aroma, as is the case of Jesus' sacrifice, as is the case of the Philippians' sacrifice and their behavior, or it could be smoke in the nostrils of God continually, being of a defiled nature, being of an evil and wicked nature. And so the question for us, and again, this is just a short thought for us today, is what type of aroma am I sending up to God in my behavior and in my conduct, my character and example? What kind of sacrifices am I offering to the Lord? Because everything I do, everything I say, and indeed everything I think, is ultimately a sacrifice to the Lord. Whether I am aware of it or not, whether I think about that being the case or not, it is. Again, the people in Isaiah 65, Jehovah's people, even though they thought themselves holy and righteous, they weren't, obviously, and God describes how defiled they were. but I'm sure they didn't consider themselves as sending up an aroma of smoke continually in God's nostrils, a nasty aroma, as it were. And yet, what we see from, for instance, for the Philippians, what they did, whether they realized it or not, they may have just thought that, well, we're helping Paul because he's a brother in Christ, he's an apostle, we love him, and we want to help him, we want to give of our means to take care of him. Paul says they did all that, certainly, but that what they did was a sweet-smelling aroma. It was a sweet sacrifice, a sacrifice that was well-pleasing to God. And so we have to consider what we're doing by our deeds, by our actions, our thoughts, our conduct, our example, whether or not we're offering up a sweet-smelling aroma to God or a nasty smoke in God's nostrils. Just something to think about, and I want to thank my dad for suggesting this as a daily devotional. In fact, I fully intend to make it a lesson at some point as well. There are other scriptures that we can also consider, but for our daily devotional today, I think these three succinctly kind of bring out that point that we want to consider, especially as we enter into our weekend and we enter into what June generally is recreational period and so forth, to make sure we continually, not just on Sunday on the Lord's Day, or Wednesday night or whatever night maybe brethren get together to study the Bible as a congregation, but every day that we offer up sacrifices that are well-pleasing to God. All right, that's the daily devotional for you today. Lord willing, our next daily devotional will be Monday at 6:30. I hope to see you all then. Thanks, everybody.